Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. Well, it's finally here, Stamptember, a month-long crafty celebration by Simon Says Stamp. Today's cards feature the newly released Hexagon background. I'm using a highlighting technique with gouache to really enhance that 3D appearance. All of the backgrounds for these cards were ink blended on Bristol Smooth cardstock using Distress Oxide inks. The ink blending was done off camera, and all of the colors for each of the backgrounds will be listed in my blog post. For the first 3 backgrounds, I've stamped them with Versamark ink, and then they have been embossed with either gold, silver, or white embossing powder. Often when I work with foam-backed red rubber stamps, I just lay it down directly on my glass crafting mat. It holds securely and I don't have to worry about slippage. The downside is you really do have to make sure that you apply pressure evenly across the panel because it's a one-shot deal. While applying pressure, I do take a fair amount of care to make sure that that panel doesn't shift and ruin the impression. Because of the large area that is being embossed, the panel can warp. To minimize this, I do a couple of things. Firstly, I apply the heat when the heat tool has come to its maximum temperature. And secondly, when I'm applying the heat, I apply it to both the front and the back of the panel. For the last panel, I want black embossed lines. Personally, I'm not a fan of black embossing powder. I find it difficult to avoid getting black specks everywhere. What I do instead is stamp with black onyx VersaFine ink and then apply clear embossing powder. You would never know that black embossing powder had not been used, except it has a much cleaner look. The next thing I do is apply the highlight areas using a watered down gouache. Although gouache is an opaque paint, when it is watered down, it is translucent. I work in rows across the panel, painting all the parallelograms. I think they're parallelograms. The highlighting enhances the 3-dimensional look of this repeat geometric pattern. Now to put the cards together. For this first panel, it has been die cut with Simon Says Stamp A2 thin frames. The small panel has been mounted on black sheet foam. This die produces a thin frame. I've replaced the orange one with a matte gold one. The outer border and the frame are adhered to a top-folding A2 size card base. The foam-mounted panel is then attached. Simon's Hexagon tiles and clustered leaves and outline were used to die cut ink blended and matte gold cardstock. The tiles were adhered to black foam, and the clustered leaves were dry embossed using Simon's Lumen embossing folder. Simon's Big Scripty Hugs was die cut from both the ink blended cardstock and black foam. The foam die cut is left intact in the background, only removing the centers of the letters. A thin layer of glue is applied to the foam die cut and then the ink one stacked on top. After a few adjustments, it is set aside to dry for a few minutes before the excess foam is removed. This card is finished off with lots of gold confetti topped with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. When the drops are dry, they are clear, leaving a jewel-like appearance. The black embossed panel is die cut with one of the dies from Simon Says Stamp stitched rectangles. Simon's sunflower stem is die cut from vellum paper. I don't want any splotches or squiggles of glue showing through my die cut, so I run it through my XYRON machine. The sliding cutter is a nice feature. The die cut flower is burnished with a bone folder to make sure that the adhesive layer is adhered. After the film is removed, I'm left with a die cut that is more like a sticker on backing paper. So now back to the panel. I'm going to be using a sentiment die cut by Simon called Warm Hugs. After the panel has been die cut with Simon Says stitched rectangles, I use the shadow die to cut out where the sentiment is going to sit. The sentiment is going to be positioned on the lower right-hand corner of the card to make room for the sunflower. The panel is going to be mounted on black sheet foam. Because I want the sentiment to be recessed, I use the die cut opening in the panel to position the die on the foam. Once the cut has been made, the background is adhered to the foam and the excess is trimmed off. The Warm Hugs lettering is adhered to the shadow cutout. The border needs to fit edge to edge, so I just double check to see if the card base needs to be trimmed down. Simon stitched rectangles produces a double stitch detail. If the border is retained like it is in this case, there will be a stitched outline on the border as well as one on the panel. I first attach the border to a top folding A2 size card base. The foam back panel is first adhered to black cardstock before it goes on the card base. This will ensure that when the sentiment is recessed that no white will be showing through. The excess black cardstock is trimmed down and then the foam back panel is attached to the card base. The sunflower stem die cut out of vellum is basically a sticker and ready to pop on the card. One of the leaves is trimmed off so that it does not overlap the sentiment. XYRON's Creative Station is a wonderful little tool to have on hand. One of the features that I really like is that the adhesive is repositionable for a while. This card is finished up with beautiful iridescent confetti in blues and purples and topped with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. When the drops are dry and clear, this confetti looks amazing. This next card is in landscape orientation, and I've die cut Simon's Heart Parade from both white cardstock and vellum paper. This time I'm using the XYRON sticker maker, which is perfect for small die cuts. I'm feeding through the white cardstock heart outline and the vellum heart interiors. As with the previous card, I give the die cuts a good burnish with my bone folder and then remove the clear film. So this is where I learned that the adhesive from the XYRON is repositionable. Because this die cut is so delicate, I found it best to just lay one end of the die cut down and start putting in the interior pieces. When I tried laying down the die cut in its entirety, the hearts were slightly misshapen and so the interior pieces would not fit properly. Working left to right, placing one heart down at a time and its interior piece made it all fit together perfectly. The shadow die from Simon's beautiful die set was used to cut the background. After it was mounted on foam, the SCRIPTY word beautiful was adhered to it. And I used my jewel picker to help me dot that eye. I'm using the same stitched rectangle die that was used in the previous card. This time I'm just using the interior panel and adhering it to a top folding A2 size card base. After the foam back sentiment is attached, I stamp a secondary sentiment from Simon's Tiny Words Birthday. I use black onyx VersaFine ink and then clear emboss it. For a perfectly straight sentiment strip, I like to use Simon's sentiment labels. I use my guillotine cutter to trim off the ends, mount it on foam, let the glue set up for a couple of minutes, and then trim off the excess. After the sentiment strip is adhered, I'm ready for the finishing touches. A light coating of Nouveau glaze is applied to every other heart in Heart Parade. Of all the glazes, I really like working with this particular brand. It seems to be the perfect consistency to control the amount that you use. When I'm done, I apply chunky glitter to all the glazed hearts. This panel has been die cut with a smaller die in the stitched rectangle set. It is then die cut with the shadow die from Simon's Hello Crafty Friend. This panel is then mounted on white sheet foam and trimmed down. The shadow die from the sentiment was also used to cut foam, and the die cut was stacked on it. The SCRIPTY sentiment for this die set is quite fine, so I use Tombow glue to dot on it and then let it dry until it is tacky. The border is attached directly to a top folding A2 size card base. The foam back panel is also adhered to it. Once the Tombow glue is dry on the SCRIPTY sentiment, it is repositionable, making it easy to align on the shadow die cut. The sentiment is adhered to the card. There are some interior die cuts in the shadow panel that are inlaid. This card has been accessorized with an adorable die set by Simon called Art Supplies. All the watercolors were kept to more or less the same colors that are in the background, blues and soft greens and some purple. Once the watercolor set is adhered to the card, it is topped off with a super cute paintbrush. The sentiment is highlighted with some pretty iridescent lilac colored sequins and topped with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. And then I went back in and added a few more, and that wraps up this set of cards featuring a new release for Stamptember, Simon Says Stamps Hexagon background. A combination of an ink blended background with embossing and then highlighting with gouache is just one of many ways that this background stamp can be used. This is but one product in a really incredible release for Stamptember. Each day there will be a special announcement, post, prizes, and promotions. Happy Stamptember, everyone, and as always, I appreciate your visit.